In the autumn of 1978, in the folded valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, a particular kind of hope was being cultivated. It was a hope rooted in soil, timber, and sweat. This was the era of the Back to the Land movement, a quiet exodus of families from the cities seeking a life of tangible realities. They were trading concrete for packed earth, fluorescent lights for the slow turn of the seasons. Their goal was not just survival, but a kind of purity, a self-sufficiency that felt like the most profound form of freedom. But freedom in these mountains had a price, and that price was paid in foresight. Winter was the great arbiter, the force that separated the diligent from the dreamer, and the currency of winter survival was the harvest. Every jar of canned beans, every string of dried apples, every bushel of potatoes was a bulwark against the lean months of snow and ice. The preservation of this bounty was not a hobby. It was the central, defining challenge of their existence. In a small, unnamed hollow, carved out by a persistent creek, one man's preparations were drawing puzzled stares. His name was Elijah. He was older than most of the new settlers, a man who had arrived not with a library of paperback manuals on homesteading, but with a silence that seemed to contain its own form of knowledge. His hands were thick, his movements deliberate, and he spoke with a faint, unplaceable accent that marked him as an outsider among outsiders. While his neighbors were busy reinforcing their sheds, building cold frames, and wiring up generators to power chest freezers, Elijah was engaged in a task that seemed, to the practical eyes of the community, profoundly illogical. He was digging into the north-facing slope of the hill behind his modest cabin. This in itself was not strange. Many were constructing root cellars. What was strange was how he was doing it. He was digging a trench, a long and narrow passage into the hillside. But the floor of this trench was not level. It was not even close to level. It descended at a noticeable, deliberate angle, a slope so pronounced that a loose rock would immediately roll to the bottom. To anyone who had ever dug a foundation, a ditch, or even a simple privy, this was a fundamental error. Water would collect. The structure would be unstable. It was wrong. Day after day, through the crisp October air, the community watched him. They saw him lining the sloped passage, not with concrete blocks or treated lumber, but with massive flat field stones he hauled from the creek bed on a stone boat pulled by his own stubborn strength. He fit them together with a patient precision that bordered on artistry, leaving tiny gaps filled with a mortar of clay and sand. It was an immense labor, a Sisyphean task that made no sense. What did this quiet old man, with his strange tilted tunnel and his creek-tumbled stones, understand about the earth that his well-read, determined neighbors had missed? What secret was he burying in that hillside? And why did he smile so faintly when others offered their well-meaning, logical advice? The conventional wisdom in the hollow was a tapestry woven from magazine articles, government pamphlets, and shared experience. Preserving the harvest was a science, a battle against time and decay, and it was fought on three fronts: canning, freezing, and traditional cellaring. Canning was the most common. The hiss of the pressure canner was the season's defining sound, a rhythmic pulse of self-reliance. Kitchens steamed for weeks as beans, tomatoes, and peaches were sealed in glass jars, a vibrant mosaic of summer's labor stored on wooden shelves. But it was energy-intensive, requiring immense amounts of heat, and there was always the lingering, unspoken fear of botulism, a single mistake that could turn a pantry of life into a cabinet of poison. Freezing was the modern ideal, the pinnacle of preservation. It locked in flavor and nutrients with technological certainty. A few of the more established homesteaders, like Noah, had invested heavily in this approach. Noah was a young, charismatic engineer from Ohio, a man who had traded a career in designing circuit boards for a life of designing a more perfect homestead. He was a natural leader, his confidence infectious, his knowledge seemingly encyclopedic. His pride and joy was a large, diesel-powered generator, housed in its own insulated shed. It powered his workshop, his water pump, and most importantly, two massive chest freezers in his basement. For Noah, this was the perfect synthesis, the rustic life, but with the fail-safes of modern technology. He could preserve his meat, his vegetables, his fruit, with the flick of a switch. It was, he often argued, the only way to be truly secure. Then there was the traditional root cellar, Most families had one, typically a small block-walled room in the corner of a basement or a simple pit dug into the ground, roofed with heavy timbers and mounded with earth. These were functional to a degree. They kept produce from freezing, but they were notoriously difficult to manage. They were often too damp, leading to rot and mildew. Or they were too dry, leaving potatoes shrunken and wrinkled. They lacked proper ventilation, allowing the ethylene gas released by ripening apples to accelerate the spoilage of everything else. They were a passive, imperfect system, a gamble that some of your food would last, but an acceptance that much of it would not. Into this landscape of established methods, Elijah's project was an aberration. It fit into no known category. It was a cellar, yes, but it was being built with a flawed design that seemed to invite the very problems, water pooling and temperature instability, that a good cellar was meant to solve. His neighbors, people who spent their days grappling with the unforgiving logic of nature, could not comprehend it. They saw only wasted effort, a monument to one man's stubborn refusal to learn the accepted rules. Noah, motivated by a genuine sense of concern and a healthy dose of pride in his own expertise, felt compelled to intervene. He walked over to Elijah's property one afternoon, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Elijah was on his knees, carefully setting a large gray slab of granite into the wall of his sloping tunnel. He did not seem to be using a level, but rather sighting along the stone, his eye making a calculation Noah could not fathom. "Elijah," Noah began, his voice friendly, reasonable. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but I've been looking at this trench. I'm worried you're going to have a real problem with drainage come the spring thaw." Elijah paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. He looked at Noah, then at the trench, then back at Noah. "The water will go where it is meant to go," he said, his voice quiet. Noah pressed on, gesturing with his hands as if explaining a diagram. "Right, and it's meant to go downhill. It will run right down your tunnel and pool in your storage chamber. Everything will rot. You need a French drain at the entrance, and the floor of the cellar itself needs to be level, ideally with a slight grade to a sump pit in the corner." He was quoting directly from the best homesteading guide of the decade. He knew he was right. "No pit," Elijah said, and turned back to his stone, tapping it gently with a hammer. The finality in his tone was not hostile, but it was absolute. Noah felt a flash of frustration. He was trying to help. "And the slope itself," he continued, his voice taking on a more pedagogical tone. "I understand wanting some air movement, but this is just a chimney lying on its side. Any cool air you manage to trap in there is just going to flow right back out the entrance. You're fighting gravity. It defies the basic principles of thermodynamics. Cold air sinks, it's dense, it will settle at the lowest point, which is your entrance, and then spill out." Elijah stopped his work again. He looked up at the younger man, his eyes holding a deep, weary patience. "Air is like water," he said slowly. "It moves. You do not trap it. You guide it." This cryptic statement was the end of the conversation. Elijah returned to his work, his focus total. Noah stood for a moment, baffled and a little insulted. He had offered sound, scientific advice, and it had been dismissed with a folk proverb. He walked away, shaking his head. The story of his failed attempt to help the old man made its way around the hollow. It became a piece of local lore, told with a mix of pity and amusement. Elijah's slanted hole was a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring common sense. At the community potluck that weekend, there were quiet jokes about whether Elijah was digging a cellar or a sled run. The consensus was that it was a shame, a terrible waste of an old man's dwindling energy on a project that was fundamentally, scientifically, doomed to fail. Through it all, Elijah remained impassive. He heard the whispers, he saw the sideways glances, but he did not argue. He did not explain. He did not defend himself with words. His response was written in stone and soil. He just kept working. He hauled more rock. He mixed more clay. He dug deeper into the hill, his movements a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the chorus of doubt that surrounded him. He was building his answer, not speaking it. His faith was not in persuasion, but in the coming cold. Winter would be the judge. What the community saw as a flaw was in fact the very heart of the design. It was a system of elegant simplicity, a passive engine powered by the laws of physics that Noah had correctly cited but fundamentally misunderstood. Elijah was not fighting gravity, he was harnessing it. He was building a device known in his ancestral homeland as a convection-driven thermosiphon, a design perfected over centuries of trial and error in mountains far older than these. The science was both simple and profound. It began with the slope. The precise 7-degree angle of the entrance tunnel was not arbitrary. It was the optimal grade to ensure that colder, denser air from the outside would flow gently, consistently downward into the cellar chamber. This wasn't about trapping cold air, as Noah believed. It was about creating a slow, steady river of it. The main storage chamber, a 10 by 12-foot room at the end of the 15-foot tunnel, was buried 10 feet deep in the hillside. At this depth, the Earth maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, a geothermal constant of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the first layer of insulation. The second and more critical layer was the stone. Elijah had chosen his materials with meticulous care. The walls were primarily granite, a dense and structurally sound stone that could bear the immense weight of the earth above. But interspersed within the granite, particularly in the floor and the lower walls, were large, smooth slabs of soapstone. Soapstone has one of the highest specific heat capacities of any natural stone. This means it can absorb and store a vast amount of thermal energy. In this context, it was a battery for cold. Throughout the autumn nights, the river of cool air flowing down the tunnel would chill the thousands of pounds of soapstone. The stone would absorb this cold, holding it deep within its mass. During the warmer days or during a midwinter thaw, the soapstone would slowly release this stored cold, buffering the chamber against any temperature fluctuations from the outside world. The R value, the measure of thermal resistance of the cellar, was not just in the 10 feet of surrounding earth. It was magnified by the 12,000 pounds of thermal mass inside. It was a system that didn't just block heat, it actively absorbed and managed it. But temperature was only half the equation. The true genius of the design was its solution to ventilation and humidity, the twin demons of food spoilage. At the very back of the storage chamber, rising straight up through the earth, was a second, smaller shaft. It was a chimney, 6 inches in diameter, made of stacked clay pipe, emerging discreetly among some ferns 20 feet up the hillside. This was the engine's exhaust. As the cool, dense air flowed down the entrance tunnel and into the chamber, it would slowly be warmed by the residual heat of the earth and the slow respiration of the vegetables themselves. As it warmed, it became less dense. It would rise. This slightly warmer, more humid air, carrying with it the ethylene gas and any potential mold spores, was then pushed inexorably toward the rear of the chamber and up the vertical chimney, exiting into the open air. This created a vacuum, a slight negative pressure that pulled more cool, fresh air down the entrance slope. It was a perfect, self-regulating loop. A thermosiphon, a slow, constant, imperceptible breath. The cellar was alive. It inhaled cool, dry air and exhaled warm, moist, and stale air. This constant air exchange prevented the buildup of ethylene gas, dramatically slowing the ripening process. And it allowed Elijah to precisely control the humidity. By partially covering the chimney outlet with a flat stone, he could slow the rate of exchange, allowing the moisture released by the vegetables to raise the humidity inside to the optimal 90 to 95% needed for root crops. Compared to this dynamic living system, the other methods were crude and static. The conventional pit cellars were stagnant tombs. They had no air exchange, no way to vent the ethylene that caused a single ripening apple to spoil a whole crate of potatoes. They were passive insulators, but they did nothing to manage the internal atmosphere. They were a sealed box, destined for failure. Noah's freezers were the opposite extreme. They were islands of absolute technological control, but they were brittle, fragile systems. They waged a constant, energy-intensive war against the ambient temperature, their compressors cycling on and off, burning fuel to maintain an artificial Arctic. Their success was entirely dependent on an external, uninterrupted supply chain of diesel fuel, a chain that stretched for miles over treacherous mountain roads. Elijah's cellar required no fuel, no electricity, no moving parts. Its only input was the natural temperature differential between the night air and the deep earth. It was a system built for resilience, not just efficiency. It was designed to function not when things were going well, but when they had gone completely wrong. The signs began in early January. They were subtle at first, the kind of old-world observations that the new settlers, with their scientific charts and barometers, tended to dismiss. Elijah noted that the squirrels, who were usually content to raid the bird feeders by midwinter, were still frantically gathering and burying black walnuts, their movements sharp with an unusual urgency. He saw woodpeckers drilling their holes not on the trunks of trees, but on the underside of the largest branches, a behavior said to predict a heavy coating of ice. The woolly bear caterpillars he'd seen in the fall had been almost entirely black, their orange bands impossibly narrow, a folkloric harbinger of a winter of unparalleled severity. The official forecast spoke of a cold snap, a few days of freezing rain. It was a standard winter weather warning for the Appalachians. Nobody was particularly alarmed. They had fuel, they had food, they had sturdy roofs over their heads. They were prepared, or so they thought. The storm arrived on the evening of January 22, 1979. It did not come with the fury of a blizzard, but with the deceptive, almost gentle quiet. The temperature hovered just at the freezing mark as a steady, persistent rain began to fall. It was not snow, which could be shoveled. It was not sleet, which would bounce. It was a supercooled rain that froze instantly on contact with any surface. By morning, the world had been transformed. Every tree branch, every power line, every fence post was encased in a perfect crystalline sheath of ice. It was a landscape of breathtaking, terrible beauty. As the day wore on, the rain continued and the ice grew thicker. An inch, then 2. The slender branches of the dogwood trees drooped to the ground, then snapped with a sound like a rifle shot. Then the larger limbs of the oaks and maples began to go, crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar that echoed through the hollow. The power lines, sagging under an impossible weight, were the next to surrender. One by one, the transformers blew, each one a flash of blue-green light against the gray sky, followed by an echoing pop. By nightfall on the second day, the entire region was dark. The low, reassuring hum of the electrical grid, a sound so constant it was never noticed until it was gone, had been replaced by a profound and unnerving silence, punctuated only by the crack of falling timber. This was the moment Noah's generator was built for. With a flick of a switch, his house came back to life. His lights flickered on, his water pump whirred, and most importantly, his 2 chest freezers continued their quiet, cold work. He felt a surge of pride and vindication. While his neighbors huddled around wood stoves and lit their homes with kerosene lamps, he had warmth, light, and security. He had prepared correctly. His system was working. But the storm was relentless. For 3 days, the freezing rain fell. The ice accumulated to a thickness of over 3 inches. The roads became impassable, not just from snow, but from a treacherous combination of sheer ice and a tangled web of fallen trees and power lines. The hollow was completely, utterly cut off. Noah's generator ran flawlessly for 4 days. He rationed his fuel, running it for a few hours in the morning and a few in the evening. But his 50-gallon diesel drum was a finite resource. On the 5th day, it ran dry. The sputtering cough of the engine as it died was one of the most dreadful sounds he had ever heard. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. His house, his sanctuary of technological certainty, was now just as cold and dark as everyone else's. The true crisis began in the basement. Without power, his freezers were nothing more than well-insulated boxes. For a day or two, they held their cold, but slowly, inexorably, the temperature inside began to rise. From 0 degrees Fahrenheit to 10, then to 32, the great threshold of thawing. He and his wife began a frantic effort to cook and can what they could on their wood stove, but it was an impossible task. They had hundreds of pounds of meat, vegetables, and fruit. They watched, helpless, as their entire year's work, the foundation of their food security, began to soften, to weep, and then to spoil. The faint, sweet smell of decay began to permeate the house. Throughout the hollow, a similar story was unfolding. The families with smaller, propane-powered refrigerators found their tanks running empty with no hope of a delivery. Their modern appliances failed them. Those who relied on traditional root cellars found their own set of problems. The prolonged, deep cold had penetrated the ground more than usual, and many of their cellars were too cold, freezing their potatoes into glassy, unusable stones. Others, poorly ventilated, became damp and musty, and a fuzzy gray mold began to creep over their squash and onions. The community's preparations, which had seemed so robust just a week before, were proving to be tragically inadequate. They were facing a slow-motion disaster. 2 weeks after the storm had ended, the hollow was still isolated. The roads were still blocked. The power was still out. A fragile system of rationing and barter had been established. People were surviving on canned goods and dwindling supplies of flour and rice. The mood was grim, a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Noah, once the confident leader, felt a deep sense of failure. His high-tech solution had been the most catastrophic failure of all. He had not just lost food, he had lost the certainty that had been the bedrock of his identity. It was desperation that finally drove him to Elijah's cabin. He had watched the old man's chimney. A thin, steady plume of smoke rose from it every day. There was no sign of panic, no change in his routine. While the rest of the hollow was gripped by a quiet anxiety, Elijah seemed to exist in a state of calm. Noah swallowed his pride, a bitter pill. He needed to know if the old man had any food to spare, but more than that, he needed to understand how he had been so wrong. He knocked on the cabin door. Elijah opened it, his face calm, his eyes showing no hint of surprise. He invited Noah in. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of baking bread. There was no sense of crisis here. "Elijah," Noah began, his voice strained. "We're running low. My freezer's failed. I've lost almost everything." Elijah nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not gloat. He simply put on his coat and his boots. "Come," he said. "Let us see what the winter has left us." He led Noah not to his pantry shelves, which were indeed well stocked with jars, but outside into the frozen landscape. He walked to the humble wooden door set into the hillside, the entrance to his ridiculed cellar. It was covered in a thick layer of ice, and it took their combined effort with a pry bar to break it free. With a great groan of frozen wood, the door swung open. A wave of air washed over them from the dark opening. Noah braced himself for the musty, cloying smell of rot he had come to associate with cellars and failed refrigerators. Instead, the air that emerged was cool, clean, and vibrant. It smelled of damp earth, of apples, of potatoes, of life. It was the smell of a perfect autumn afternoon, miraculously preserved in the heart of a frozen world. Elijah lit a kerosene lantern, and its warm glow pushed back the darkness of the sloping tunnel. He led the way down. The air grew cooler, but it was a pleasant, stable cold, not the biting, damp chill of a basement. They entered the main chamber. What Noah saw stopped him in his tracks. The room was filled, but not cluttered. Bins of potatoes and carrots lined one wall. The potatoes were firm to the touch, their skins smooth, with no sign of sprouting or shriveling. The carrots were crisp and bright. Crates of apples were stacked neatly, each one gleaming in the lantern light, their skin taut and unblemished. On wooden shelves, winter squash and pumpkins sat, their rinds hard and their color deep. A thermometer, hanging from a wooden beam, read a steady 39 degrees Fahrenheit. A simple hygrometer next to it indicated the humidity was 92%. This was the hard, undeniable data of success. Outside, the temperature was barely 10 degrees. Inside Noah's own house, it was a miserable 45. Inside his dead freezers, a rotting 50-degree mess was a testament to his catastrophic failure. He had lost, by his own estimation, at least 90% of his frozen stores. The families with conventional cellars were reporting losses of 40 to 60% from freezing, rot, and pests. Here, in this simple hole in the ground, the evidence was overwhelming. Elijah gestured to a small pile of shriveled apples in a corner. "My losses," he said. It could not have been more than 5% of his total harvest. Over 90% of his food was in perfect, pristine condition. Elijah picked up an apple and handed it to Noah. Noah looked at it, then back at the old man. He saw the elegant simplicity of the stone walls, the gentle slope of the floor beneath his feet. He could feel the slow, almost imperceptible movement of the air, the cellar breathing around him. He finally understood the physics he had dismissed, the cool air flowing in, the warmer air flowing out the unseen chimney, the thermal battery of the soapstone, the harmony of it, the genius of it. It was a system that did not fight nature, but collaborated with it. He took a bite of the apple. The crunch was loud in the quiet chamber. The flesh was crisp, juicy, and sweet. It tasted of sunshine and autumn, a flavor he thought he had lost for good. Tears welled in his eyes, born of relief, shame, and a profound, humbling awe. He looked at the old man, whose quiet confidence now seemed not like stubbornness, but like a deep and abiding wisdom. "I was wrong, Elijah," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so wrong. I came here to give you advice, quoting my books and my science. But this is perfect. I don't understand how, but it's perfect." Elijah smiled, a true and gentle smile this time. "There is more than one kind of book," he said, tapping his temple, "and the oldest ones are not written on paper." Word of Elijah's success spread through the hollow, not like a rumor, but like a revelation. Noah, humbled and transformed by the experience, became the old man's unlikely messenger. He brought the other families, one by one, to witness the miracle in the hillside. They came with skepticism and left with wonder. They felt the clean, cool air. They saw the rows of healthy, life-sustaining food. They touched the firm potatoes and the crisp apples. They saw the simple thermometer declaring its quiet victory over the brutal winter. It was undeniable proof, a tangible lesson in humility. Elijah's slanted hole was no longer a joke. It was a beacon of hope. He shared his bounty freely, asking nothing in return, and his quiet generosity cemented the community's newfound respect into a deep and lasting reverence. When the spring thaw finally came and the roads were cleared, the first delivery truck to make it into the hollow was not carrying propane or groceries. It was carrying shovels and pickaxes that Noah had ordered for the community. The sound that filled the valley that spring was not just the chirping of birds and the rush of the creek. It was the rhythmic scrape of steel on rock, the thud of earth being moved. Under Elijah's patient guidance, the community began to build. Noah, once the advocate for modern technology, was now the most zealous convert to the old ways. He worked alongside his neighbors, his engineer's mind now dedicated to understanding and replicating the elegant physics of the thermosiphon. He learned to read the slope of the land, to select the right stones, to mix the clay mortar. He became Elijah's apprentice, translating the old man's quiet, ancestral knowledge into a language the other homesteaders could understand. That year, 5 new slope cellars were dug into the hillsides of the hollow, each one a monument to a lesson hard learned. The lesson of that brutal winter was not about the failure of technology. Noah's generator and his freezers were not inherently bad. They were simply fragile. The true lesson was about the danger of arrogance, the folly of believing that the newest solution is always the best one. It was a lesson in humility. The Back to the Land movement had been born of a desire to reconnect with something essential, yet in their eagerness, many had brought with them the very mindset they sought to escape. A belief that nature was a problem to be solved, an adversary to be conquered with engineering and ingenuity. Elijah's cellar represented a different philosophy. It was a system born not of conquest, but of conversation. It was a dialogue with the landscape, an understanding of its natural tendencies, of gravity, of convection, of the Earth's stable heart. It was a testament to the power of observation, of knowledge passed down not in textbooks, but through generations of people whose very survival depended on getting it right. This ancestral wisdom, dismissed as folklore, contained a sophisticated field-tested science that modern methods had overlooked in their rush for control. It was a reminder that the most resilient systems are often not the most complex, but the ones that integrate most seamlessly with the world around them. Elijah lived in the hollow for another decade. He never held the title of leader, but he became its heart, A quiet elder sought out for his wisdom on everything from planting by the moon to mending a broken tool. He taught the children how to find north using a tree's bark, and he shared the seeds his family had carried from the old country for generations. He never spoke of the great ice storm or his moment of vindication. He had no need to. The proof was all around him, in the sturdy wooden doors set into the hillsides, and in the pantries that remained full, year after year, no matter how harsh the winter. The original cellar he built still stands today. The cabin is gone, but the stone-lined tunnel remains, a permanent feature of the landscape. The current owners of the land, a young family new to the area, discovered it while clearing brush. They found that even after years of neglect, the air inside was still cool and fresh. They cleaned it out, and today they use it to store their own harvest. It still works perfectly, a silent, enduring legacy of a quiet man who listened to the earth and a community that learned to listen to him. It is more than a hole in the ground. It is a library of forgotten knowledge, its lessons written in stone.